I wanted to get into the digital age, you see, for a this is the third time, my third talk has been recorded. So, are you ready? I think I'm ready. Got my hearing aids in, they work. False teeth are in, they work. Glasses work. No, forget about that. This damn thing in the back of my head, though, that memory enhancer, I have so much trouble with it. You have to fool with it all the time to get it to work. I had to pay for it myself. It was $1,000. The VA hospital wouldn't pay for it, Veterans Hospital. They said, Mr. Harrod, we don't want to improve your memory. You're too subversive as it is. So it's a very conservative outfit, Veterans Administration. But anyway, they have good health care. So I can't believe, there we go. Encuentro 5, another group of young outlaws and misfits. Anarchists probably, I bet. So I'm in the right company. I've been a misfit all my life, so I feel comfortable. And here it is, the second time in a month I'm talking about a rather grim topic. I can't believe it. I'm trying my best to be upbeat and everything. But this World Bank story is a horror story, if there ever was one. And for us, it comes across as a horror story. For them, it's a wonderful success. I mean, the people who set it up, it's just fabulous. So, so that's going to be one of the themes of my talk. Is this? We've got two conceptual frameworks here going, and they're constantly getting intertwined and mixed up. And I'll try to separate those and clarify them a little bit. Well, the World Bank was established in 1944. There'll be some overlap between what I'm saying and what Peter said. Fortunately, he mapped out the structural adjustment program in much more detail than I've got, so that was good. And so World Bank was established in 1944, 1 year before the World War II ended. I was 9 years old at the time. So actually the World Banks in my life have sort of been running in parallel, co-determinous, concurrently. And so the bank is 67 years old. Wouldn't it be sweet if the World Bank would just die when I die? But that's not going to happen, we know, because social institutions live by a different calendar than we do, so it's going to go on. I mean, social institutions aren't necessarily immortal, although in some cases it seems so, like the abominable Christian church has lasted for 2,000 years now. So what are you going to do about that? All right. Well, I pretty much ignored the World Bank all my life, except 3 weeks ago, Peter and Monica and I have trouble with names. So they asked me to do this study, and I did a crash program studying up on the World Bank, and I'll do the best I can. I'm not a real expert on this, but I've tried to get a picture of it. And so there's one aspect, though, I might put in a little personal note. The story does have a certain poignancy for me because when I spent my senior year in college at the American University Beirut in Lebanon, and it was 1956. I just turned 21, and on Christmas vacation, I went with a bunch of students over to Egypt, and somehow I got connected up with this Iranian guy who's a little bit older, and he had a connection there, and he got us a ride, got a truck, and just just the two of us, or maybe a third person, we went down to the Nile Delta. 80 million people in Egypt, and a lot of them live in the Nile Delta. It was the most incredible experience. It was stunning poverty. This stunned me. It's very densely populated, one peasant village after the other, living in abject poverty. This was in 1956. So that got me sort of interested in the question of why are some countries poor? And that kind of set the direction of my life for the next decade or so. Because when I got to graduate school at Columbia University in 1961, that's what I focused on. Why are some countries poor? I was going to write a thesis on Turkey because I had spent in the Army. I had spent a year in Turkey. So I spent the next 7 years sloshing through the murky swamp waters of mainstream social science, and didn't have a clue about why some countries are poor. I remember this seminar I took with Theodore Kaplow, professor there, and we took a book a week and read it, and the major theories of why are some countries poor. And I have to give him credit. He was honest. He said, well, so at the end of every week we'd review the book, and well, that didn't work, did it? I mean, that doesn't explain anything. So we did that the whole year or semester, maybe it was. And at the end of the term, he said, well, we don't have a theory to explain this. And he was right. But all we were studying was mainstream social science. Thank God for me and my life, SDS took over the university the next year. So I was there, SDS, that's Students for Democratic Society, these young radical students, and they occupied Hamilton Hall, and they started the great revolt at Columbia University in 1968. Of course, we know now that it was happening all over the world. May 68, that's when France exploded. So I was able to discover radical social philosophy. So once that happened, I mean, there was a very well worked out theory of imperialism from Marxists and the radical students of capitalism. So the whole question just disappeared for me. I mean, there was an answer. It was a perfectly fine answer. Why are some countries poor? So I just lost interest in the whole topic, and I left that and went on to other things. So that's a little personal thing. There was another little part of that, though. All through the 50s and 60s, of course, the Marxists always had a theory of imperialism. But in the academy, it was mainly the theory of underdevelopment. And so all through the 50s and 60s, radical scholars were chipping away at this. And by the end of the 60s, they had totally demolished. I'll get to this in my talk later when we talk about the ideology of the World Bank. And so that sort of got came to a head, got summarized in the work of Immanuel Wallerstein. That's that completely overthrew the mainstream theory of underdevelopment. They called it underdeveloped then. Then this whole thing went through a series of changes, and they said less developed, and then they settled on developing. So we have developed countries and developing countries. Sounds better than saying underdeveloped, you know. I mean, it's so they do this kind of stuff all the time. Euphemisms, clean up their language. They steal good words from us, and they put a. Okay, so here's the outline of my talk: institutions of U.S. imperialism, Bretton Woods, World Bank, ideology of the World Bank. Then we'll look at some projects of the World Bank: dams, coal, logging, mines, water, and cash crops. So I was told to focus on the impact of the environment. The World Bank does a lot of other stuff besides just the environment, but they do educational programs. And so, okay, the thing to, I might be preaching to the choir here a little bit on this. I hope not, but I hope I can put it in a broader context. Because the U.S. imperialism, of course, it's part of that, right? So the situation at the end of World War II was that the United States came out of that war undamaged and supreme. It was the world power. There's no other country could match it in terms of wealth and industrial production. It was a center of finance, center of industry, center of agriculture and banking. All the main sectors of the economy were dominated by the United States. Okay, so they wanted to set up a system where they could dominate the world. And this is very clear in the statements that they made at the time. The people who set up the Bretton Woods conference. So let's take the word imperialism, though. See, this is already an abstraction. We have to really be careful about abstractions because they're dangerous, treacherous. Imperialism. So, you know, if you're a radical, you have a certain view of that. For most of the 40 years of the counter-revolution that I've lived through, we couldn't even use the word imperialism. We can now. The last 10 years has come back. And we can even talk about capitalism now. But still, the mainstream view is that, do you know the work of Chalmers Johnson? He was a cold warrior, and he served the empire most of his life. But in the early 90s, he switched. He turned against the empire. So he wrote 3 books about the U.S. empire. Didn't mention capitalism once. So see, this is what we're dealing with here. They've managed to eliminate the greatest ideological victory of the ruling class in the last century is to eliminate the concept of capitalism from discourse, and that's what we have to deal with in trying to sort through. Somebody mentioned the language stuff, and trying to sort through all this. That's what we're dealing with, is that they're trying to explain the world without taking capitalism into account. And so the mainstream theories try to do this, and that's why so here's what we have. There have been lots of empires in history, but you have to look at the unique characteristics of the empire you're in. Like here's an excellent book to read called by Ellen Wood, The Empire of Capital. And so she distinguishes the empire that we have is distinguished by capitalist dynamics. Whereas if you're talking about the Roman Empire or earlier empires, they were based on other kinds of stuff. So that's that. Okay. So here's the main principle of the U.S. government system imperialism is to make the world safe for American capitalists. That's it. You think that's simplistic, but it's not. It's profound. And it's been that way since the founding of the country. Make the world safe for American capitalists. This is what undergirds all the foreign policy. Okay, take the word foreign policy. This is a euphemism right there. It's an abstraction. It doesn't mean anything. It should be called the Department for Exploitation and Domination of the World. You know, it's not foreign policy. Foreign policy can mean anything. Okay, so the major institutions of U.S. imperialism, it's vast. It's vast. I mean, and the World Bank is just a part of this. But the Pentagon, State Department, U.S. Treasury Department, Wall Street, National Security Agency, all the intelligence agencies, there are 21 of them. They've now solidified them into the Homeland Security. The CIA, the U.S. Aid Department. This is a big institution that Export-Import Bank, Peace Corps. Do you all know the Peace Corps? I was in a Peace Corps called it was called the Committee of Returned Volunteers from 68 to 71. It was my main radical affiliation at the time. I wasn't in the Peace Corps, but I'd been overseas on work camp programs run by the International Work Camp Association. So this was turned out to be by the end of the time, we were a really radical group, and they worked out a theory of anti-imperialism. They occupied the Peace Corps building in Washington, D.C. in 1970, the big demonstration in 1970. I didn't go in, but I was a support troop outside. Okay, and also, that's just part of it, security treaties, United Nations, tariff and trade policies, diplomacy, surplus food. So this is the whole structure of U.S. imperialism. Okay, Bretton Woods. July 1944, New Hampshire, gathering of 43 governments. And the United States' aim was to secure U.S. domination of the world. And so they agreed on three documents. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and Tariffs, that's the GATT, the famous GATT treatment, International Monetary Fund, and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. That's the World Bank. That's what it was originally called. So there were a couple of people in the State Department. This is a thing that Peter mentioned with John Maynard Keynes. He was part of this, setting this up, along with a couple of people in the State Department, Harry White and Morgenthau. And they were interested in keeping a government hand in things. But by the time it was over, within a year, it had shifted to Wall Street. Wall Street won. Okay, so now let's take the World Bank. This is my topic. And it's actually 5 organizations. It's not one. They call it the World Bank Group, but we'll just call it the World Bank because that's what it is. It started out the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, but very quickly, these names are all similar sounding and they're hard to keep straight. International Development Association, International Finance Corporation, International Investment Guarantee Agency, that's the insurance, and then the International Center for Settlement of Disputes. So here they have the whole thing all together. The first one, the Reconstruction and Development, that's was aimed primarily at Europe at first. It's sort of government funded. Then they set up this IDA, International Development, so that was for poor countries with lower interest rates. Then the International Finance Corporation, that's the private industry end of the World Bank. It's where most of the money comes from. They go to private investors. Okay, take the word investors. Sounds good, right? It's a positive thing. All it is rich people who have money, and they're trying to make money off of money. And so, it's not a positive thing at all. When they're trying to say we've got to protect our investors, that's what they're talking about. So, so these are the 5 institutions, and they have the insurance end of it. They cover that. That's for companies that don't want to go in and buy up something or start a project in some country because it's too risky. So they have an insurance program. That's part of the World Bank. And they also have investment disputes. Okay, now what did surprise me about this when I got into it a little bit was the size of it and the penetration. I hadn't really focused on how big it is. It's 187 countries. That's practically the entire world, except for small city-states like Monaco and Liechtenstein. The only 2 countries that aren't in the World Bank are North Korea and Cuba. Cuba withdrew in 1964. I don't know what happened to North Korea, whether they excluded or they never applied. But so you have to be a member of the International Monetary Fund before you can become a member of the World Bank. So these are all connected. So in 2010, they had assets of $108 billion. This is really a big, that's a lot of money. And they have 100 offices in countries around the world. They have 10,000 employees. in 160 countries. So the thing that's amazing, this is a major arm of U.S. imperialism, and we'll get more into what that means. Peter described it really well, the structural adjustment stuff that he was talking about. It's a way of opening up a country. So what happened at the end of World War II, which I was explaining, I missed that before, is that the old empires were dying. They were being. This was the beginning of the great period of national liberation struggles in the world, where country after country was overthrowing their colonial masters. So what the United States did, it said, okay, we don't want to be an imperial power. Yeah, right. So it was called neocolonialism. There are good books on neocolonialism. I should have put some on the list. But so they invented this system where they didn't have to have direct colonial control like they now have reverted to in Iraq. They got direct colonial control. But for all of this period, especially World War II to 1970, this boom period of capitalism, they managed to get neocolonialism established. This was a way for the core capitalist countries in Europe and the United States to keep control of the rest of the world. So currently, the World Bank is running 2,608 projects. And each project has different locations, so there's 15,000 project locations. And they've won, since 1947, they've ran over 10,000 projects. So this is pretty big. It's a pretty big operation. They penetrated the whole world. And as Peter pointed out, these are not grants. They don't give money away. They make loans. So the World Bank is actually a business. It's a bank. It's called a bank, and it is a bank. I read, one of the things I read in studying up for this was that one of these outfits, I think it was the International Finance Corporation, hasn't lost money a single year since it was founded. They are making money off of the colonial world. All right, this is going fast. I'll probably get through this in a half hour. And then people who know more about some of these environmental things than I do. But I want to talk now about the ideology of the World Bank. Okay, the theory of development, and see, when I lost interest in this topic in the late '60s, I did notice as the years went on that people were still talking about this. The politicians used these terms in this frame of reference, and I could see that it was still being taught in the universities. And that was kind of disappointing because, when you see an intellectual system completely demolished and overthrown, you'd think the world would go on, they'd accept this, but they didn't. But then I got into the global warming thing, and that whole framework was still there in the global warming, in the trade agreement, the international treaties about global warming. The development framework is there. And then out here is the World Bank. It undergirds everything. Okay, what is this theory? Well, if you eliminate capitalism from the equation, you have a picture of the world of independent autonomous states. So the traditional development theory is that each of these states, these governments, are going through a series of stages to develop. There was a famous book in the 60s, Walt Rostow, called The Stages of Development, Stages of Growth. Development, by the way, is another one of these words. What does development mean? Well, it means growth, right? And what does growth mean? Profit. It means profit. Growth means profit. You make more money. And that's from the radical point of view. But for them, no, it's not. So you have these two conceptual frameworks that are in class. You should read the way the World Bank describes itself. Its focus is on helping the poorest people in the poorest countries by using its financial resources, staff, and extensive experience to aid countries in reducing poverty, increasing economic growth, and improving the quality of life. Okay, so here's the problem. Do they believe this? I mean, we don't believe it. Okay, so the development model is these separate countries are going through stages, and some countries are further along than others. So if you have an aid program to help countries develop, you want to help them to go through these stages. And the alternative theory, the radical theory, which takes capitalism into account, is that you have one world system. It's a capitalist system. This was true even with the Soviet Union. Soviet Union was a form of capitalism. So the term third world even is a misnomer. There was never a third world. You've got the capitalist world. That's it. So the way the radical theory came out, and here's the person to read, Wallerstein. Does people know Immanuel Wallerstein? How many people? 1, 2, 3. Okay, well, it's a good start. It's such a shame in the American anarchist movement. I'm not talking about Boston. We have scholarship. But on the West Coast, in many parts of the country, the primitivism thing is just pernicious. Zerzan is the worst thing ever happened to American anarchism. They're reading Zerzan instead of Wallerstein, the world-class anti-capitalist scholar. Anyway, this little book, Historical Capitalism, I highly recommend if you want to understand the system we live in. Although this is not the book to read for well, it is in a way, but his other stuff is more focused. Some of his other stuff focused on what we're talking about, development, and he's the one who really wrote up the overthrow of the developmental model. What you have is the core countries, according to Wallerstein, core countries, and the periphery, and then you have semi-periphery, and the core countries extract wealth and resources from the poor countries. So that's the way it works. It's one world system dominated by the core capitalist countries. And this whole question of development is just nonsense. I mean, most of the countries of the world are not going through stages of development. They have been and still are being systematically underdeveloped by core capitalist countries. So that's what these Bretton Woods institutions do. They underdevelop the world in order to enrich themselves. But it's not greed, it's capitalism, profit, money. Well, let's see, how can I make this a little clearer? Okay, well, how did capitalism get eliminated? This might put it in a slightly broader context for some of you. How did capitalism get eliminated from the picture, the concept of capitalism? Not the reality. That never got eliminated yet. We're going to do it, though. Well, here's how it happened. In the late 19th century and the early 20th, there were these massive movements, anti-capitalist movements, socialist, anarchist, communist. They were doing theoretical work. They had Marx and the anarchists. They had a really great critique of capitalism, and this scared the ruling class. So what they did was they set up a counter theory, counter scholarship, counter everything. I call it it's called mainstream social science. Social science, mainstream social science as we know it in this country, sociology, economics, political science, were invented to counter the radical anti-capitalist analysis by socialists and communists. This happened between 1890 and 1920, when this was established. Max Weber, George Simmel, Emil Durkheim in Europe, the great conservative. Here's a good example of how that happened. In 1911, there was this great book written by a German anarchist, very wonderful anarchist writer, Gustav Landauer, 1911, and he then in the same year, another book was written by this conservative political scientist, Robert Michel, called Political Parties, in which he argued that hierarchy is inevitable. And so what happened? Michel's book got translated by 1915, went on all the reading lists in the U.S. universities. It's a famous book, Michel's Political Parties. Whereas Landauer's book never got translated until 1976. It was done by this New Left publisher, Telos. They finally put it out. But even then, nobody knows it. Finally, AK Press has a reader on Gustav Landauer. It's the first stuff in English to put a lot of it into account. So his stuff is good. So that's how they did it. So what they did is they split social knowledge into disciplines. They separated out the economy from the society, from the politics. Whereas radical theory doesn't do that. There's no such thing as an economy. It's just, radical categories are totally different. They use alienation, exploitation, surplus value, abstract labor, use value labor, the whole series of concepts. But it's been very effective because it separates it lets people think that there's such a thing as an economy, and the state is separate from that, and all that. So this is the problem in dealing with the World Bank, because it's based on this mainstream model, for one thing. But if you look at the charters, which I haven't, but I've read Michael Hudson. The two best books to read about the international financial system are Michael Hudson, Super Imperialism, and Michael Tchaikovsky, Globalization of Poverty. These are very thorough descriptions of the international financial system and how capitalism works. But Hudson, throughout, he'll be talking about something, and he'll say, well, they can't, I haven't read this whole book. It's very hard going, it's pretty dense. But I've read a lot of it, and I read a lot of Hudson. I read his stuff as it comes out. And I'm not so enamored with him as I used to be, because he doesn't seem to be really against capitalism. He's against the financial aristocracy, financial oligarchy. He wants to get back to the real economy, productive economy. So after that, it's different. But anyway, what I was saying is that he'll become discussing, oh, they can't do that because it's in the bylaws. The bylaws of the World Bank are set, and the IMF are set up so it has to support what the things that Peter outlined, the tariff thing, the focus on private enterprise, and that. But even someone as smart as this guy, and I saw him at once. They slip. Within the IMF, its Chicago School of Monetarists eventually have learned nothing from the failure of their austerity programs in the 1960s and 1970s. And then in parentheses, he says, The alternative is to conclude that their crippling programs are deliberate. Well, of course they are. Of course they're deliberate. It's not a failure. All of these things we're constantly reading about how these programs are not working, they're a failure. Oh, they're not creating development. They weren't set up to do that. They're working wonderfully well. They're an incredible success story for the ruling class because they're sucking wealth out of the rest of the world at phenomenal rates. It's been a highly successful program in terms of enriching the rich capitalist core countries and the ruling classes and impoverishing everyone else. I mean, that's what they're set up to do. So that's the main thing in dealing with that you have to be aware of. Now, I believe actually that a lot of the people who work for the World Bank, by the way, it helps to read their own book, how they describe themselves. I think 10,000 people is a lot of people. And I think a lot of the staff and the bureaucrats in the World Bank actually believe this stuff. And the proof of that is that there are always people that are defecting from the World Bank. And then they write a book, say, oh, Jesus, that wasn't working, and they try to expose what's going wrong. And the main thrust of a lot of the work being done on the World Bank is to reform the World Bank. They want to get it to follow its own guidelines. Another proof that that it's just ideology is that they'll do these studies. The World Bank itself will fund studies. They'll set up independent commissions. They did one on dams. So the independent commission comes up with this report and says, all of these things you're doing are really destructive. I mean, they're horrible. You got to stop doing it. But they don't stop doing it because it's written into the bylaws that first thing comes to the investors, profit for the investors. So this whole thing about reforming the World Bank, I mean, are you going to try to reform the Pentagon, the State Department, ExxonMobil? Are we going to try to reform these institutions? So why don't we just abolish them? That's the way to go. Abolish the Pentagon and the CIA. Okay, so now we'll take a look at some of the environmental things. I think that's the best I can do on clarifying. And this is going to be kind of skimpy. I've read the stuff, but it didn't stick in my head. A damn implant. No, it's not working. So, okay, I do dams, coal, logging, mines, water, cash crops. And the story's the same on all of them. What the bank does is to enslave the world to debt. It's a strategy. It's a neo-colonial strategy. You get people in debt, and they have to pay off the debts. It's just like with the American working class. If you get them in debt, then they're slaves. Hudson calls that the debt peonage. So I did learn a few things. Like, did you know that there are 45,000 high dams in the world? That's a lot of dams. I wasn't aware that there were so many. And the World Bank has loaned $50 billion for dams. It has supported the construction of 600 dams since 1944 in 92 countries. So there was such an outpouring of resistance to this that in the 90s there was a lull in dam financing, but now it seems to be back in full steam. I want to call your attention to two of them. One is the Narmada Valley Dams in India. It's a river that starts in central India and flows to the west coast into the Arabian Sea. And it's famous because of the people were really rose up to protest this dam, and it's incredible what they're planning to do. They were what happened to my? They were going to build 3,000. I find this incredible, but that's what the report is. They were planning to build 3,300 dams on this river system. 50 of them were, oh, here it is. 50 of them were big dams, and then a few hundred smaller dams, and then a bunch of little dams. I don't know what a little dam is, but 3,300 dams. So the people there launched a pretty strong protest movement to try to stop it, but they didn't. The last I read, the main dam was the Sardar Dam, and it's just they finished it. But I want to call your attention to Arundhati Roy. You all know Arundhati Roy? She is one of our brightest lights. So if you haven't read her, you gotta. She's Indian, and she wrote this book called The Greater Common Good. You can probably download it off the internet. It's about dams. It's just a marvelous essay. And she just takes the whole thing apart and how destructive. She not only up on all the research on dams, there's a pretty huge movement about dams on how bad they are. They don't work. But this has no impact on the World Bank or any of the others. It's not just the World Bank that's building dams. Building dams has been part of capital civilization. Well, they need electricity. So the reason why World Bank funds dams is because they can sell the electricity and pay back the loan. All of the World Bank projects are based on whether they can pay back the loan. So that's a big limitation. So they focus on these big things. They don't support small things that are not, and certainly don't support things that are not going to make money. So it's all tied into Wall Street, investors, profit, and paying back the loans. Okay, so now the other one I wanted to call attention to is the World Bank is financing a big dam in the Amazon. I can't believe this. They're going to start damming the Amazon River, and it's going to flood millions of acres. It's going to destroy forests, and it's just insane. But it's going through. And okay, so we should ask, well, how come these governments always go along with this? Well, the governments are tied in. The ruling elite of each country is tied into the world capital system. So not only do they siphon off a lot of money through corruption and so forth, but they have their hands in the investments. Like Mubarak and his family, and the ruling class in Egypt, they're all millionaires. And they say Mubarak has 70 billion. You never know whether that's true. It could be an internet urban legend. It just gets up. So there's the dams. Okay, the same thing with coal. Coal, they've loaned $4.4 billion in 2010 for coal-fired power plants. $1.3 billion to China for 4 massive coal-fired plants. $3 billion for a plant in South Africa, which is creating a lot of controversy. So, well, what's the story on coal? Well, we know that it's the biggest contributor to CO2 emissions. There are 2,300 coal-fired power plants. This is coal-fired power plants in the world. About 600 here, 600 in China, but that leaves 1,200 for the rest of the world too. So even if China and the U.S. got off coal completely, it'd still be 1,200 coal. The thing with this, China is about to bring online 500 new coal-fired power plants just in the next few years. So that's double their number. And at least 36 countries are in the process of building new coal-fired power plants. So this is disastrous in terms of global warming and the environment and destruction of mining coal. But the World Bank is supporting it. Why? Well, because it makes money. They can sell coal, and they can pay back the loans. All right, the same story with logging. The World Bank is active in all the great rainforests of the world: Amazon, Congo, Indonesia, New Guinea. What they do is they loan money to lumber companies, and then, of course, they insure those lumber companies to go in and log the forest. And this, of course, is with permission of the governments, too, because they're all tied. So this would be more effective if I'd get with it and get into the modern age and have a PowerPoint here. I could show you pictures of all the devastated forests. But the mines, it's the same thing. I know this was supposed to be about the environment, but it's the same story. I don't know, unless I had the details of, I can talk about specific, maybe I could do the logging thing. In Brazil, there's this, the bank lent $445 million for the Northwest Brazil Integrated Development Program. They built roads into the Amazon so that people could go in there, and of course that means they're going to log the forest. And they'll do the same thing in Congo. There's a big controversy with the pygmies. The pygmies got upset because forests are being cut down. And they did the same thing in Indonesia. The World Bank provided $500 million to move 3.6 million people off the island of Java to the outer islands so that they could cut down this forest, called the Transmigration Program. So you just take it case by case. I printed out all these things of the various projects around the world. But okay, the mines is the same story. You see, mining. There's a big gold mine in Guyana. And here's, this is a highly toxic operation. Gold mining uses cyanide, and they dump the cyanide waste into the environment. It's just unbelievably destructive. Plus, it leaves a huge scar on the earth. So they're into gold mining, nickel mining, copper mining, and it's everywhere. Sierra Leone, Suriname, Papua New Guinea, Peru. There's a big gold mine in Peru that the bank funds these programs. All right, the last one would be, no, two more. Water. All right, this is so discouraging. The World Bank makes loans to large water corporations so they can buy up municipal water systems. These corporations always promise cheaper rates and better service. What they deliver is higher rates and worse service. And Peter was telling you about Copacabana struggle. We should highlight this and propagate it because it is important. It was a victory, but it's one of the few victories that they're winning all over the world. They're doing this. They're privatizing water systems everywhere. There was a small town in Northern California that had a victory too. They had sold their water company to water system to a company, and the same thing happened: higher rates, worse service, the infrastructure decays. So they took it back. And there is I read one website. There's a privatization thing going on about water. It might be gathering some steam. But Manila in the Philippines sold their water system to two corporations. It was a city of 10 million people. Oh, I wanted to quote Barlow, Maud Barlow. She's our brightest light on the water. She wrote a book called Blue Gold. and then another new book called Blue Dimension. But even she is, listen to this. There is profound disagreement among those in the water world around the nature of the threat and the solution to it. A growing movement of people believe that the imperatives of economic globalization, unlimited growth, a seamless global consumer market, corporate rule, deregulation, privatization, free trade are the driving forces behind the destruction of our water systems. These must be challenged and rejected if the world's water is to be saved. What's wrong with this list? No mention of capitalism. It's just incredible how even with radicals, capitalism as a concept gets eliminated. All of these things stem from capitalism. So why not say, okay, this is a capitalist system based on profit, accumulation of capital, private ownership, property, commodification. And then she goes on, and her main focus is on asserting that, God, this is going on. Water is a right. It's a human right and shouldn't be commodified. But why stop at water? Why not say food? Food is a human right. Shelter is a human. Why stop at water? I mean, this is a mistake to phrase it like this, to just take water and say we're going to decommodify water. Well, it's a start, but wouldn't it be better to just say everything has to be decommodified? And what that means is capitalism is gone. Capitalism based on commodification. So, okay, so that's water. Now, cash crops. Okay, well, this is the same story over and over again. What they want to do is turn the world into a source of raw materials and so the story with agriculture is that the World Bank and the IMF says that you have to go grow cash crops for export. So that's coffee, cotton, sugarcane, biofuels, cut flowers, soy, beef, stuff like that, which are not good for nutrition. So what their program does is destroy local farming and food self-sufficiency. And of course that makes people dependent on the subsidized agriculture from the core countries. And also you get fertilizers along with it and pesticides. In other words, agribusiness. The World Bank pushes agribusiness. India, their commodification of the seeds, and along with this, monocultures. In terms of the environment, monocultures are extremely destructive because they destroy biodiversity. And okay, that's it. I see a lot of people. I'm sorry, but that's what I did.